This is Domain 5, Identification and Authentication of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. We'll go through the objective of the entire domain, the objective of each practice, levels and practices, and a knowledge check. So our domain objective, identification and authentication, the domain activities ensure identities who have access to controlled unclassified information, or CUI, are established, managed, and authenticated in accordance with CUI protection requirements. So listed here are our practice objectives. We'll go through all of them though. And for this domain, we have practices in level 1 and level 2. So this domain, identification and authentication, includes 11 practices, 2 at CMMC level 1 and 9 at level 2. So first up, identification. Identify information systems users, processes acting on behalf of users or devices. So we want to determine if system users are identified, processes acting on behalf of users are identified, and devices accessing the system are also identified. Authentication. Authenticate or verify the identities of those users, processes, or devices as a prerequisite to allowing access to organizational information systems. So we want to determine if the identity of each user is authenticated or verified as a prerequisite to system access. So before being allowed access to any of the system information, the identity of each process acting on behalf of a user is authenticated or verified as a prerequisite. And the identity of each device accessing or connecting to the system is also authenticated or verified, again, as a prerequisite to system access. So those are our level 1 practices. Our level 2 practices are starting off with multi-factor authentication. So we want to use multi-factor authentication, sometimes seen as MFA, for local and network access to privileged accounts and for network access to non-privileged accounts. So for the assessor, you'd want to determine if privileged accounts have been identified. Multi-factor authentication is implemented for local access to privileged accounts. It's implemented for network access to privileged accounts and implemented for network access to non-privileged accounts. So anybody accessing the network should go through multi-factor authentication before being granted access. Replay-resistant authentication. Employ replay-resistant authentication mechanisms for network access to privileged and non-privileged accounts. So determine if the mechanism replay-resistant authentication is implemented for network account access to privileged and non-privileged accounts. Identifier reuse, prevent reuse of identifiers for a defined period. So the period within which identifiers can be reused is defined, and reuse of identifiers is prevented within the defined period. So you want to have a decent waiting period before reusing a unique identifier for a workforce member. Identifier handling, disable identifiers after a defined period of inactivity. So a period of inactivity after which an identifier is disabled is defined, so we know how long that period is. Identifiers are disabled after the defined period of inactivity, so this is actually a practice that's been put in place and is enforced. Password complexity. Enforce a minimum password complexity and change the characters when new passwords are created. So determine if password complexity requirements are defined. Password change of character requirements are defined. Minimum password complexity requirements are defined, are enforced when new passwords are created. Minimum password change of character requirements as defined are enforced when new passwords are created. Password reuse. Prohibit password reuse for a specified number of generations. The number of generations during which a password cannot be reused is specified, and reuse of passwords is prohibited during the specified number of generations. Temporary passwords. Allow temporary password use for system logons with an immediate change to a permanent password. So determine if an immediate change to a permanent password is required when a temporary password is used for system logon. Cryptographically protected passwords. Store and transmit only cryptographically protected passwords. Determine if passwords are cryptographically protected in storage. Passwords are cryptographically protected in transit. Next up, we have obscure feedback, with a practice description being obscure feedback of authentication information. So we want to determine if authentication information is obscured during the authentication process. And now we'll have a quick quiz. Question 1. Describe practice identifier IA.L2-3.5.11, obscure feedback. And our answer here, of course, is D, obscure feedback of authentication information. Question 2, describe CMMC practice identifier IA.L2-3.5.3, multi-factor authentication. And our answer for question 2 is C, use multi-factor authentication for local and network access to privileged accounts and for network access to non-privileged accounts. Question 3, select the practice identifier associated with this CMMC practice. Employ replay-resistant authentication mechanisms for network access to privileged and non-privileged accounts. And our answer here is C, replay-resistant authentication, which can be found at IA.L2-3.5.4. Question 4. Describe CMMC practice identifier IA.L2-3.5.6, identifier handling. And our answer here, again, is C, disable identifiers after a defined period of inactivity. Question 5. Select the practice identifier associated with this CMMC practice. Enforce a minimum password complexity and change of characters when new passwords are created. And our answer here is B, password complexity, which can be found at IA.L2-3.5.7. Thank you.